On various occasions, we learn in Hebrews that Jesus wept. One such instance occurred in Luke chapter 19, verses 41 to 44. But why did he weep? Let's read and find out what it can tell us about Jesus and our own lives today. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it, and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you, and encircle you, and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." So the first thing that I noticed in this passage is that Jesus wept, which is really interesting because previously there was shouting and cheering, if you read before in this passage. In Luke 19, verses 37 to 40, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. Then the Pharisees tell Jesus to calm his disciples down, and he says that even the rocks will cry out. And so what's interesting here is that previously with the shouting and the cheering of the disciples, and then yet Jesus has this inner turmoil going on. And I think we can see the difference between man's focus on the palpable and man's focus versus God's focus, which is really interesting, that Jesus is crying. And we're going to talk about why he was crying and why he was weeping. And so we get to this next point where we see that Christ's humanity is to show us the heart of God, that Christ cries, he wept. And the word here for wept is not just crying, but that there's heaving, that there's motion going on. It is a very physical act. Christ was upset, obviously, and it shows this humanity in him, that even though he was 100% God and 100% man, somehow we see that humanity shining through here. And we see in other instances, too, that he does cry or weep in the Bible, which is interesting. But even in the early church, there were people who didn't want to accept this part of the Bible, so they had kind of edited it out. Regardless, we do see that Christ's weeping is actually a beautiful picture of God's heart, and to show us that even God himself cares deeply for his people. And so in Hebrews 5:7, we can see that during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. And so in different times, the other specific moment in the Bible that we can remember is that Jesus wept when Lazarus died and Jesus went. And so to me, it seems as though right now he is weeping in this section because of his knowledge of the past, present, and future of Jerusalem. So then we can see Jerusalem's rebellion. So the word Salem at the end and Shalom have similar roots, and so city of peace would be a possible translation for Jerusalem. So if you look before Jerusalem was even part of Israel, you see the Israelites throughout the book of Judges rebelling, and then in the cycle of rebelling. Things are okay. They forget about God, and then they start ignoring, what his plans are for their lives, and they don't follow him anymore. They rebel, etc. And then God allows other peoples to basically conquer them. They cry out to God because they're oppressed. God sends a judge. The judge delivers them from that problem. And then the same thing. Now there's a time of peace, and the same cycle goes over and over and over again. And so it's really interesting. Within a generation or two, they've already forgotten about what God has done to deliver them, and they keep going through that. And so later we do see that as well. Once David establishes, his reign in Jerusalem, we also can see some rebellion in his heart and some of the decisions that he makes. Then we see later it gets worse as new kings come, and slowly Israel is split, and you have the two different kingdoms. And then Judah is where Jerusalem continues. People continue to rebel. The kings are wicked, and occasionally you have some good ones, but most of them are bad and far from God. And so you see that eventually God just allows them to be conquered. And so you have other empires that came and conquered. You have the Assyrians, Babylonians, you have others, and then the Romans, of course, talking about today. And so then we can see that the spiritual condition in their hearts will lead eventually to physical oppression. And so the rejection of the prophets, which he talks about in the different parts of the New Testament, and then they rejected Jesus' message that Jerusalem did, or the people in Jerusalem and just Israel itself for the most part did. And as we'll see a little bit later, various groups of the Jews did not want to submit to Rome either, and to the powers. And so we see that it starts with a hierarchy where if you submit to God, then other areas you can submit. It doesn't mean that you tolerate things that are unjust necessarily, right? But you're more inclined to be able to to submit and to accept God's hierarchy. However, when you reject God, then it's easier and easier and easier to reject order and hierarchy in other areas of your life, and submission, of course. The rebellion, then, it leads them to blindness. So what you can see is that they have rebelled and rebelled and rebelled against God by rejecting his prophets, rejecting Jesus' message, and they are blind. But what's so interesting here is that you can even see in Jerusalem in 66 AD, they take over Jerusalem, which we'll talk about in a second, but they take it over, and they're doing that because they don't want to worship other gods. So they're doing something, believing that what they're doing is right. They still have this religious fervor and zeal, and yet their hearts are not following God's true message through Christ. So they believe that they're following God, and in their actions, they're still trying to follow God, but they still somehow missed out on the message. The more and more we rebel, we get desensitized to it, right? So the worse and worse things that you do doesn't feel so bad anymore, which Jesus will equate to blindness. They have a spiritual blindness because they perhaps have a fervor for law or politics, etc. Their hearts are not following God's heart. Therefore, they're blind to his purposes. And so then we see the judgment. In verse 43, Jesus says, "Your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side." Which is really interesting if you look up something called the Siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Around 40 years later, not quite 40 years, but around 40 years later, the Judean rebel factions controlled the city. And at 66 AD, they took control of it, and they expelled the Romans from the city of Jerusalem. The future emperor Titus led a siege and surrounded the city, I think in 70 AD. And the Judean forces fought themselves. So even within the city itself, these Judean forces, they were rebels from Rome. They were against Rome, obviously. And they were doing this because they didn't want to. Rome was obviously pushing everybody to just kind of accept all religions, this kind of almost this moralistic therapeutic deism we see today, this God of the age of all religions lead to one place. And so Rome was trying to get everybody to accept all religions, and the Jews refused to do this. So you can appreciate their zeal for worshiping God. But interestingly enough they lacked proper leadership, and they were even fighting amongst themselves, which shows some interesting things about human nature. When they removed God from the hierarchy, they lose the order that they require, right, that God would give them. And so Titus built a 5-mile-long wall around the whole circumference of the city. And so it fulfills this prophecy that Jesus talks about this embankment against them and encircling them. And as a result of that, the historian Josephus estimated 1.1 million non-combatants died in that. Many of them were visiting from afar for Passover, and they died of famine because the entire city was blocked from these walls, and also the siege could have killed them, which, as Jesus talks about, you could see why he wept. He was weeping because he knew what was going to happen to these people because of their hard hearts, and they weren't going to have peace. And so finally, does he weep for you? So now we see that the rebellion from God, it then leads to rebellion in other areas of our life. So in Romans 1, you can see that it talks about, the Apostle Paul talks about and kind of gives you this history of the human experience. And it starts off with idolatry. And you might say, well, I don't have idolatry in my life. I don't worship idols. I don't have a Buddha, or I don't have a whatever, what have you, statue in my house. Well, I can guarantee you there's an idol in your life. Because if you look at the Garden of Eden, when God gave the command to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, some fake news came through a serpent. And so when they thought about the command, they then thought, well, God said this, but I think this. And so what it did was it put man or mankind's thoughts and feelings over God's command, which is idolatry. Idolatry would be putting anything from the created above the creator. And so if you worship the created before the creator, it's idolatry. And this can basically, the people might these days believe created things offer us hope or salvation. If you believe that, and so this is really tricky because in the Bible it might tell you something to do not do something, or you might feel convicted to not do something, and yet you might rationalize it. I'm guilty of this all the time. You might rationalize it and say, well, his word says this, but I think this. Ooh, well, you just put your heart, your thoughts, etc. above God's commands. And what God wants for you, therefore, that is idolatry. You're idolizing yourself over God. We do this often by believing in created things that offer us hope or salvation above God. And so we might believe that a government offers us salvation, or perhaps politics will offer us, a politician will offer us hope or salvation, or fame or fortune, money, family, friends, popularity, etc. Any of those things are not necessarily bad, but when we put those things above God, they are bad. When we believe that those things will bring us hope or happiness or salvation, etc., then our hearts are in the wrong place. And so I encourage you to remember today that only Jesus offers us lasting peace and hope. Luke 19:42 that we read today said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes." Remember that constant rebellion of Jerusalem, of ignoring the prophet's words, ignoring Jesus' words. It eventually led them to having numb hearts. They couldn't see what was before them. And so my question for you today would be, where does rebellion start in your heart? Because it's not where it's all of a sudden you're just rebelling completely. It starts very, very, very small places. In Matthew 16:24-25, Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." And I from experience, it's kind of frustrating to share this, but every day we have to take up our cross. And if you think about that in the context of Jesus, that meant certain death. So here he's saying, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and basically die. And this is a daily thing that you're supposed to do. It's not just, one time. Every morning that I wake up, I have to deny myself, deny my dreams, deny my desires, lay them at God's feet. And I have to die to the me that is always kind of pushing and trying to get out as an idol in my own life. And I have to do that in order to follow Christ. But that rebellion starts, sometimes it's just a small area. For me, it could be, I don't want to pray this morning, right? It's just a small thing. I don't have time, so I don't want to pray this morning. Or, oh gosh, I don't have time at this point, so I'll just rush through the prayer, or I'll just rush through the reading of his word. And that rebellion starts in such a small place. And yet it leads to larger consequences and larger rebellion, because again, as you remember, if you remove God from the hierarchy, if you remove that submission to God, the submission in all the areas of life, everything will then be out of order. And so, unfortunately, men and women make very poor gods. The other question to ask you would be, does Jesus weep for you or someone you know? And I encourage you to be praying for that person and to share with that person and just pray that God would open their eyes and to take away that blindness. And finally today, I want to ask you one more question, which is, do you weep as well for others? In Romans 12, it tells us to rejoice with those who rejoice and to mourn with those who mourn. But this is weeping for them as Jesus wept for Jerusalem. Can you see somebody going in the wrong direction? And can you tell them about Christ? Can you tell them about his peace that he offers and his love and his acceptance that he offers them? And that nothing else will bring them the peace or the joy like he does. Everything else will chew them up and spit them out eventually, and will leave them emptier than before. And so, do you weep for others as Christ wept for Jerusalem? And I pray that this reflection has touched your heart in some way, whether that be through revealing rebellion that is there, or to encourage you to weep for others. God bless. And I'll see you next week.